I must confess that probably there was an exchange of person because my name is Paolo de Lucia and I'm not from Milan. But I have a friend which is called Paolo de Lucia and he's come from Genoa. So, but I'm from Milan, but it doesn't. Well, thank you very much for coming. And first, I'd like to thank Professor Bojanic for his kind invitation. And today I will talk about normative impossibility, which is in somehow new field of research, and I will give a tentative to apply some conceptual tools offered by John Searle and his social ontology and some other scholars to investigate a complex area of phenomena that can be called normative impossibilities. And first of all, let me say something to introduce this concept of normative impossibility. And there is the way I will introduce it is to start from what we can call a non-normative impossibility. And this is a kind of impossibility that is not related to norms, or a kind of impossibility which is non-normative. And an example of this kind of non-normative impossibility is an example taken from Edmund Husserl's works, the impossibility for two colors to cover an identical piece of surface completely. So the concept I would like to introduce is a concept of impossibility which is related to norm. This example is a non-normative impossibility. What is impossibility which is related to norms? I think that we have first to start from the ambiguity of this phrase, this term, normative impossibility. And we have at least two different senses of this phrase, normative impossibility, and we can see better this ambiguity if we adopt a distinction of a different direction of fit from reality to norm and from norm to reality. I try to explain. There is a first sense of normative impossibility. There is, if we adopt the direction of fit to consider from reality to norms. And what does it mean in this sense, normative impossibility? It does mean that, for example, it is impossible for a legislator that lay down rules, that they lay down norms, to touch the proper being, the a priori structure of legal entities. This is an idea, the idea that from a certain reality, which is object of a legislation, we can derive necessarily limits to the activity of the legislation itself. An idea that, for example, we find in a German philosopher, a German phenomenologist, which is very well known, and sometimes he is considered also a forerunner of social ontology. His name is Adolf Reinach. According to Reinach, there are eternal laws governing legal entities and structure which are independent of our grasp of them, just as the laws of mathematics. The positive law, according to Reinach, can incorporate them into its sphere. It can also deviate from them, but even when it enacts the very opposite of them, it cannot touch their own proper being. So,
what does it mean to touch the proper being?
To touch it, to modify the structure, the essential structure, for example, and the example is the promising of the promising. I will try to explain with the example of the promising. According to Reinach, from promising arise necessarily a claim and an obligation. This is what Reinach in his phenomenological language called a priori law. And so according to him, the positive law, for example, can modify in some sense for example, can say that persons that are not, they are under 18 years old cannot make promises valid. But the legislator cannot touch this essential structure. Well, his idea, I don't necessarily agree or disagree, this is not relevant. But this idea, for example, there is another case, interesting example. A claim is extinguished by being fulfilled. This, according to Rein, is a priori right. So, if what Rein says is true, so that we have necessary limits to the legislation. 1 century before Rein, we can find a surprising similar thesis invoking the essence of things as a limit to the legislation in an article written by the young Karl Marx. And it is a famous article by Marx against the project of a legislation about the thefts of wood. According to Marx, the project of qualifying and punish thefts of fallen woods as thefts of wood is a denial of the essence of things. And, well, I can to try to understand better what Marx, how is the argumentation by Marx. Marx says in this very famous article, the gathering of fallen wood and the most composite wood theft. They both have a common definition, the appropriation of wood from someone else. Therefore, both are theft. That is the sum and the substance of the far-sighted logic, which has just issued laws. First of all, therefore, we call attention to the difference between them. And if it must be admitted that the two actions are essentially different, it can hardly be maintained that they are identical from the legal point of view. So, in order to appropriate growing timber, it has to be forcibly separated from its organic association. In the case of fallen wood, on the contrary, nothing is being separated from the property that is being separated from it. This argumentation, I think, is very well known, because and it reminds us in some way the essential language of also Thomas of Aquinas, because Marx says that the objects, the gathering of fallen wood and the theft of wood are therefore essential different things. The objects concerned are different, the actions in regard to them are no less different, hence the frame of mind must also be different. For what objective standard can be applied to the frame of mind other than the content of the action and its form, the content and its form? But in spite of this essential difference, you call both of them theft and punish both of them as theft. So, according to Marx, there exists objects of property which by their very nature can never acquire the character of private property. Objects which by their elemental nature and accidental mode of existence belong to the sphere of occupation rights. Here it is interesting the fact that, according to Marx, fallen wood can never acquire the status of private property because of its accidental mode of existence. So it is quite different from the Reinachian point of view, which was very essentialist, and here it is accidental mode. So I think that the first meaning, the first sense of normative impossibility could be represented by this example. But we have a second sense of impossibility, which is which can be explained, we can exhibit if we look at some examples that concern the impossibility which is relative or related to norms, but if we adopt the other side of the direction, the other direction of it, from norm to reality, not from reality to norm, as I made before. And so we have a second sense of normative impossibility. For example, the impossibility for a plant to be appointed as a life senator according to the Italian constitutive, constitutional law, or the impossibility for a woman to become cardinal in the Roman Catholic Church, or the impossibility to obtain libera docenza, today in Italy, doesn't exist anymore, the impossibility for an individual to benefit from the droit de suite, the right to follow, in the USA, except from California. So, libera docenza is the possibility to teach if a university call you, and yes.
I'm not sure about the one in California, but what's the Swiss?
A right, which is a right granted to artists in some jurisdiction to receive a fee on the resale of the works of art, and it is a right which is not, it doesn't exist in the USA except in the California. That's a colleague of the commercial law told me that this is an interesting institution that exists only in California. Yes. And so, what happens here? Well, all these cases, examples of impossibility, exist beyond the boundaries of the law. For example, we have some cases that are from the games. The impossibility of castling if the king is under check, or the impossibility of castling in draws or in checkers. So what happens here? Well, I must confess that one of the inspiration of this research is a work by a jurist that was called David Daube, that in the 19th, he used to teach in Berkeley.
Yes,
I remember good. I met him once in Berkeley, and he wrote a very interesting paper called the Greek and Roman Reflections on Impossible Laws. And I made the example of the impossibility for a woman to become a cardinal, or the impossibility for a plant to become a senator. And Daube was discussing the famous case of Caligula, who wanted to make senator or consul his horse Incitatus. And this is an example that was discussed by Pufendorf, the famous natural lawyer theorist, and other scholars, for example, Azzoni and Fez, which is here. So, I say that there are some examples from games, and probably the question of game is interesting because the idea to connect the possibility with the rules was originally introduced by Wittgenstein, who talked about the fact that when we are thinking, for example, at the chess and the king of chess, we would be, we have to think that the relation with the king and the rules. And the rules are not something, says Wittgenstein, that are contained in the idea and got by analyzing it. They constitute it. They constitute the king. So they, in some sense, they make possible the king in the sense that they constitute the freedom, he says, of the peace king. I don't know if this is one inspiration of John's idea, but you know that this distinction between rules that make something possible is one of the core theses by Searle's analysis of speech acts, and well, it is very well known the distinction between regulative rules and the constitutive rules. I don't want to read this long quotation, but what is interesting is the fact that all phenomena that I listed in the list of the impossibilities are connected with constitutive rules and with the idea of the institutional phenomena. For example, becoming a cardinal or senator, or the droit de suite, which is a right. So they are all connected with the institution. And so, according to me, when we talk about a normative impossibility, norms that make something impossible, we are talking about institutional phenomena mainly. And I would like to introduce here a distinction between these phenomena, because they seem all homogeneous, but there is a difference, I think. It is very important, and we can see this difference also if we compare them with the games examples. And the difference is something which is connected with the notion of presence and absence. Some of the examples I made are examples of impossibility that derive from the presence of rules, whereas some others seems to be dependent on the fact that we don't have rules, we lack rules. Let's see this distinction. When we talk about the impossibility for a plant to be appointed as life senator, we are deriving this impossibility from the rule, for example, of the Italian Constitution that say that the President of the Republic may appoint 5 citizens who have honored in the nation through their outstanding achievements in the social, scientific, artistic, and literary fields as life senators. Or, for example, when we talk about an impossibility for a woman to become cardinal, we start from the norm, the rules of the canon law that says that those to promote cardinals are men freely selected by the Roman pontiff, and so on. So there is a first possibility to distinguish impossibility that derive from presence, whereas the other cases, example 6, 7, 8, 9, seems to derive from the absence of rules. The fact that from the Italian law, it's absent the institution of libera docenza that was existing before, and today it doesn't exist anymore. And also the other cases could be connected with the idea of absence of rules. So,
sorry, maybe I don't understand, but example 8, I thought that was against the rules. Maybe it's just me.
Well, yes, that's something which.
Sorry.
Yes. The possibility of casting if the king is under check. Yes, no, this is an example of a presence rule. Sorry,
Okay,
it's probably a mistaken list. Okay, sorry. So there is this distinction: presence and absence. And as I told before, all these phenomena are connected with the institutions. So all these rules make the presence or the absence of these rules make possible or make impossible institutional phenomena. Okay, so I would like to say something about another question which is connected with this kind of impossibility, the second sense, the impossibility that derives from norm. And it is a case that was discussed in the legal philosophy debate of the last century, because probably this case of impossibility that derives from norms is a case which is mainly connected with the problem of the absence of rules. The absence of rules. The case was described by the legal philosopher Zygmunt Dębinski, and according to Dębinski, there is an impossibility of revoking a deputy of the Polish parliament according to the Polish constitution. But what Dębinski says is interesting, because according to Dębinski, this gap of construction of the Polish constitution derives from the fact that the constitution established that the deputy of the parliament may be revoked, can be revoked. But the constitution doesn't lay down the conditions and the procedures according to which the members of the parliament can be revoked. Therefore, in the Polish order of the 1952, the revoking of the members of the parliament is an impossible act because of the lack of the norms concerning these, the mode of revoking. And so the Polish constitution has decreed that a deputy can be revoked, may be revoked. Yet, because the lack of norms regulating that act, revoking is impossible. And this is an example of a construction gap. And in this case, Dębinski used a concept which is very close to the idea of constitutive rules, because he says that it is a concept which is very used in the constitutional law, also from the beginning of the last century. The idea of rules that build something, construct something. He says, within the domain of the organization rules, the lack of a certain construction rule for a conventional act produce an entirely different effect from that produced by the lack of a simple conduct rule. In the absence of a conduct rule, an act is legally indifferent. In the absence of an organization rule, a conventional act is impossible. So the sphere of the normative order is divided into this subsphere. One of the indifferent, where the lack rules of conduct, and the other, which is the sphere of the impossibility, because some acts need rules to be performed. Well, so let's compare this last example of the Dębinski case of construction gap, the impossibility of revoking a deputy of the Polish parliament according to the Polish constitution, with the other example, the example of the impossibility to benefit from the droit de suite, or the example from games, the impossibility of castling in draws, in checkers. Which is the difference? I think that this difference is interesting, because if we look at the example of the impossibility of revoking a deputy, the impossibility seems to be an impossibility to instantiate a token of the type revoking a deputy in the context of the Polish constitution. But the type revoking a deputy is something that exists in the Polish constitution. So the impossibility seems to derive from the absence of norm concerning how to instantiate a token of that type. It is an impossibility that we can, for example, define at the token level, whereas, using the distinction by Peirce, the impossibility of castling in draws is an impossibility that seems to derive from the absence of the type itself, the type of castling in the context of the draws or checkers. So it seems to be an impossibility at the type level. The distinction I propose, and is a distinction between a token level impossibility, the example of the Polish constitution, and the impossibility at the type level impossibility. I think that this distinction, that was also studied, for example, investigated by Lorenzo Passerini, it could be a useful, a helpful distinction to investigate the area of phenomena of normative impossibility. And I think that these distinctions require probably, and this is the last point I would like to propose, a distinction of two kinds of constitutivity. So there is a feedback of this analysis of normative impossibility to the concept of constitutivity itself. Sometimes constitutive rule create certain types of action. There is an Italian philosopher who used for these kinds of constitutive rules the term, remembering Husserl, eidetic constitutive rules, because they create the type, the eidos, the forms of a certain action. Whereas, very frequently, for example, in the law, it is very frequent, constitutive rules create something, but in the sense that they determine how to instantiate a token of a certain type, but they presuppose the existence of the types. So these are two probably different kinds of constitutivity or different dimension of constitutivity that could be useful to distinguish in the analysis of normative systems or legal system. And probably, but this is only a suggestion, this distinction could be also be seen reflected in a thesis that could be could seem paradoxical by Ludwig Wittgenstein, who says that instead of you cannot, you say it doesn't exist in this game. When he says that castling, you cannot castle in draws, Wittgenstein say instead of you cannot castle, say it doesn't exist in the game. Instead, if you cannot castle in draws, say in draws castling doesn't exist. So this could be justified, this thesis by Wittgenstein, if we see the different level of the constitutivity, the level of the types and the level of the instantiation of the type through the token. Thank you very much.